This is the new 2022 13-inch MacBook Pro. Launched at WWDC almost as an afterthought, it brings back the exact same outer design as the last three 13-inch MacBook Pros dating back to 2018. Now that normally wouldn't be a big deal were it not for the fact that Apple last year had already begun transitioning to a newer MacBook design language, one with thinner bezels wrapping around a better display, more ports including the return of MagSafe, a better speaker system, and a better webcam. In fact, at the same WWDC event, Apple introduced a new MacBook Air using that new design. Now, other than looks, not much separate the new MacBook Pro with the new MacBook Air. They both run on the same software, they both run on M2, which is Apple's new silicon. The only real difference between the two machines is that the MacBook Pro has an active cooling system, which is just a fan, but here's the thing, the M2 chip is so efficient that the fan is very rarely ever needed. I have not had the chance to test the new MacBook Air yet, but I'm pretty sure performance between both machines will be identical for most use cases. So when you consider the fact that the MacBook Air is thinner, lighter, has MagSafe, has a better screen, has a better speaker system, and generally just has a newer design and is $100 cheaper, you really have to wonder, just who is this new MacBook Pro for? Okay, so that intro sounded a little bit harsh. If we take a step back and we just evaluate the new MacBook Pro in a vacuum, it's a pretty good laptop. At $1299, it's reasonably affordable, particularly by Apple standards, and the M2 chip is awesome. Since this MacBook Pro basically brings back the exact same design as the last several 13-inch machines, you should be very familiar with how this laptop looks and feels. It's a typical unibody aluminum casing with a sturdy hinge, relatively thick bezels that measures about an inch at the top and bottom. There's an LED display strip above the keyboard that Apple calls Touch Bar, and a power button that doubles as a fingerprint scanner. The laptop weighs about 3 pounds and measures 0.6 inches in thickness. That's about 15.2 millimeters for non-Americans. It's relatively portable and should fit into most bags. A 12.9-inch iPad Pro with a Magic Keyboard basically has about the same footprint as this 13-inch MacBook Pro. Now this 13.3-inch 2560 by 1600 LCD display is the exact same panel that was used in the last several 13-inch MacBook Pro, so it's a perfectly fine screen for working and movie watching, and I'm sure most average consumers will have no issues with it, but it's definitely not as vibrant as the mini LED screens we've been seeing in the iPad Pro or last year's M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBook Pros. The keyboard and trackpad are both excellent. The keys offer about 1mm of travel and they're evenly spaced, and the trackpad is large and precise. Yeah, so this design is a little bit dated and boring, but everything works well and I have no real complaints with it, with one exception, and that is the lack of ports. So this new 13-inch MacBook Pro only comes with 2 USB-C Thunderbolt ports and a headphone jack, that's it. I can accept just 2 USB-C ports on a MacBook Air, but not for a machine supposedly for pros. If you're a creative professional, you will have to use a dongle just about every day. Some people may also take issue with the 720p webcam, especially since the MacBook Air comes with a better 1080p webcam. But personally, I don't mind it too much. I think it's perfectly fine for video calls. Okay, ultimately, the only reason this new MacBook Pro even needs to exist is because of M2, Apple's new silicon. Before we take a look at performance, let's do a quick recap of Apple's silicon. So for well over a decade, Apple's computers all ran on Intel processors. Up until about 2 years ago when Apple said, forget Intel, we're going to make our own chips based on ARM architecture that are more streamlined, kind of like a small smartphone system on a chip. And the first chip, the M1, came out in late 2020 and it completely defied expectations. It was almost as powerful as an Intel processor, but far more efficient. It's built on 5nm architecture and it contains 8 CPU cores and 10 GPU cores. Apple claims the M2 offers 18% better CPU performance than the M1 and up to 30% better GPU performance. And for the most part, in all my testing, whether it's real-world testing or benchmarks, the M2 lives up to these claims. So if you take a look at these benchmark scores here, you can see that the M2 is just about 20 to 30% more powerful than the M1, but still not as powerful as the M1 Pro or the M1 Max. And Apple was keen to mention to its reviewers that the M2 is a successor to the M1, and it's not really meant to be compared against the M1 Pro and the M1 Max because those two chips are still more powerful. My XDA colleagues and I also ran several video exporting tests. We exported a 4-minute long 8K 30fps video in Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere Pro, and DaVinci Resolve. Now, due to lack of time and limited access, we were not able to do all the Final Cut Pro testing on the M1 and M1 Pro machines, but if you look at all the other scores, you can see that the M2 does pretty well. Now, just for reference, I also did the same test on a 2020 Intel MacBook Pro with an i7 and a 2022 Huawei MateBook X Pro with an 11th generation Intel processor. Now, I know these are not the latest Intel processors, but I personally did not have access to a 12th generation Intel processor. But my colleague does have access to 12th generation Intel processor, and he ran some tests too. And yeah, for the most part, a fully spec'd out 12th generation Intel machine can still pump out more raw power, but it's not all about raw power. The M2 is much more efficient than most of those laptops. You know all those benchmark numbers I showed you? I actually did those tests twice. Once with the MacBook Pro plugged into power, second time with the MacBook Pro unplugged running on battery. And all the numbers were very similar whether the M2 MacBook Pro is plugged in or not. You cannot say that about an Intel machine. You will see a performance dip if you unplug the laptop. And the M2 MacBook Pro did not even need a fan for most of those tests I did. The fan really only kicked in during 8K video rendering. This efficiency results in great battery life too. So the M2 MacBook Pro, when I'm using it as a productivity machine, so that would be Safari with half a dozen tabs open, Spotify streaming in the background, and maybe Slack running on the side, every hour of use would see about 7 to 8% battery dip. So by my math, this machine can give me about 12 to 13 hours of use for that standard productivity usage scenario. Like when I was doing the 8K video exporting test, a 30-minute exporting session in Adobe Premiere Pro drained about 30% of battery. So that means even if I'm editing video completely unplugged, this machine should last me 5 or 6 hours. These numbers are definitely better than any Intel laptop. Another benefit of the M2 is that it brings further synergy between the MacBook and iOS devices like iPhones and iPads, because now all these devices essentially run on chips that belong in the same family, the same architecture. And while this benefit isn't noticeable right now in macOS Monterey, the next macOS update coming this fall, macOS Ventura, will further blur the lines between a MacBook and an iPad and iPhone. We already know that macOS Ventura will offer a UI that's closer in aesthetics to an iPad's UI, and you'll be able to do things like switch your iPhone FaceTime call over to your MacBook seamlessly without needing to stop and restart the call. It's this level of synergy and connectivity that make the Apple ecosystem so appealing to consumers. So back to the original question, just who is this MacBook Pro for? If you're someone whose computer usage consists of mainly just reading websites, typing words, watching Netflix and YouTube, and doing the occasional video call, you really don't need this Pro model because the MacBook Air will give you virtually the exact same performance, except the Pro model will give you a little bit better battery life. And if you're a serious creative professional, let's say you're a 3D graphics artist or you're a YouTuber who make videos for a living, you're probably going to want the M1 Pro or M1 Max laptops because they still offer you more raw power. So this MacBook Pro is for people who need a little bit more processing power than the average person, but yet at the same time either cannot afford to pay or just do not want to pay the $2,000 starting price of the M1 Pro MacBook Pro. Now I think that's a pretty small group because I think most creative professionals would be okay to pay a little bit more for an M1 Pro MacBook. But I suppose there are people who fit into that niche category, maybe young college students or young working professionals on a tighter budget. But whatever the case, this new 13-inch MacBook Pro is in my opinion Apple's most niche MacBook yet. It is stuck between a MacBook Air that makes more sense to most people and a 14-inch MacBook Pro that's just better in every way. So I hope you found this video helpful. Be sure to subscribe to XDA TV if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching.